Alright, so we are inching towards the release date of The Last of Us Part 2, and if you have pre-ordered the game and haven't preloaded yet, go ahead and do that, guys. It's a whopping 78 gig download, so have enough time to do that and get ready on the 19th of June to embrace this opportunity, this beautiful world that Naughty Dog has created for us. As you might know, on the 12th of June, the embargo for The Last of Us Part 2 lifted, and guys, the reviews were overwhelmingly good. The game has a Metacritic score of 96, an IGN score 10 out of 10, Eurogamer score 10 out of 10, Game Informer 10 out of 10, Comic Book 5 out of 5. Based on the reviews, it looks like The Last of Us Part 2 is a worthy successor of an extremely successful first game. Amidst these extremely positive reviews, there were some critical reviews that caught my attention, so I wanted to go through that and talk about some things that we can expect from The Last of Us Part 2 that might be a little disappointing. Here are 4 facts as to why you would not like The Last of Us Part 2. Number 1 is going way overboard in humanizing the game. Based on what we know so far, we know that The Last of Us Part 2 is gonna be bigger and better than its predecessor in some aspects. One of the biggest features of the game is this concept of having names for every single NPC in this world. This was done in an attempt to actually make you feel human inside the game. You are obligated to make a decision to kill them or go past them. I think that this concept is interesting, but there's a sweet spot to anything. According to a certain reviewer, Naughty Dog has kind of gone overboard with it. It says, the game tries to up the ante in a very forced way by giving almost every NPC a name. If you kill someone, you'll hear their friends calling for them as soon as they realize they're missing. Hearing someone call Shannon for the 20th time pulled me out of the experience because it didn't feel natural. It was like I was being told to care about these people, who by the way were trying to kill me. As soon as Naughty Dog actually announced this feature, I was intrigued by it. I appreciated the fact that they are trying to make the game more real to the player. I thought to myself, this will be effective if it's used sparingly. If they go overboard with it and cry out the name every single time I kill a person, that's gonna be a big turnoff for me. Now of course I have never played the game, but I hope Naughty Dog has used this feature effectively and that I will be further immersed into the world of The Last of Us Part 2 rather than being taken away from it. Number 2 is a story that is out of focus. What made the first game that much special was the simplicity of the story. It was straightforward and quite easy to grasp, and the whole story was run by Joel and Ellie and their relationship. According to some of the reviewers, the story in The Last of Us Part 2 is not as focused. The story starts in Jackson and the first part is engaging and emotional as it does a good job of unpacking the events of the first game. We'll be going through some playable flashbacks, but according to the review, the game starts to lose focus during the second act of the story. It says, for roughly the first half of its runtime, Part 2 provides an engaging and emotional ride that also makes some good progress in unpacking the events of the first game, thanks in part to some wonderful playable flashbacks. Unfortunately, about halfway through, the game quickly starts to lose its focus. Many of the complaints regarding the story of The Last of Us Part 2 revolves around this side quest, which spans for about 10 long hours. It has nothing to do with the main story, and although the runtime of the game is about 25 to 30 hours, some people say that this could be packed into a 16-hour game just like its predecessor. A review says, in the place of that momentum, the narrative takes a left turn into a largely unrelated side story about former enemies turning into unlikely allies. In the process, the game leans heavily on dramatic irony, giving a winking nod to an audience that often knows the result and coming consequences of a scene before the characters involved. The occasionally lands with the genuine impact of new perspective and understanding. More often though, it hits with the wet thud of unsubtle emotional manipulation. I'm not making any judgments based on these reviews. After all, these are other people's opinions, right? My opinion would be different, and I will definitely let you know after I finish playing the game. But guys, if it is true, I would be a little disappointed, because what I loved about the first game was the simplicity of the story and how succinct it was. Alright, number 3 is intense brutality. It's an understatement to say that The Last of Us Part 2 will be violent. If you have played The Last of Us Part 1, you know what to expect. It's brutal and gory. But this time around, they have introduced new mechanics and have upgraded the graphics. So every scene is detailed, even the killing scenes. While that's pretty impressive, it might not be for everybody and it might turn some people off. For example, a review in Kotaku says, "My playthrough of The Last of Us Part 2 felt terrible to experience. Over the course of my 27 hours with the game, it grew to the point of feeling nearly unbearable. This wasn't because it asked me hard questions about my own capacity for harm or revenge, or pulled some Spec Ops the line style moralizing about video game violence. Despite Druckmann's promised philosophical questions, I never felt like the game asked me anything. Instead, it told me brutality repeatedly and louder, until by the end I couldn't hear what I was trying to say at all." Well, I kind of expected that. The game is bringing about raw violence where every blow, every stab looks as real as it gets in a video game so far. A review in Invest.com says, "The game gave me stress nightmares, not because you kill a lot of people per se, but because playing as Ellie felt more like being dragged by my hair than being immersed in her mission," she wrote. "From the very beginning, I wanted to reach out and shake Ellie as her proxy in all this and get her to do anything other than what we were about to do. I know her revenge quest was bad news before the killing and maiming really began." Now, of course, I cannot comment about The Last of Us Part 2, but I do have to say the brutality in The Last of Us Part 1 worked. It worked because we were exploring what it means to be human. Joel sacrificed a vaccine that could save mankind because of Ellie. Now, such unconditional love, selfish love, is quite relatable in the real world as well. Such acts made us connect with these two characters at an emotional level, and that's why the brutality, the violence of that game actually worked. Some reviewers say that heart is missing from The Last of Us Part 2 and is overshadowed by this intense brutality that they are trying to portray to the player. A review of Time.com says, "But if Naughty Dog's intent was to shock, leaning so heavily on the violence has the opposite effect. 30 hours into the game, it's easy to grow numb to acts of cruelty. That awe-inducing scenery and careful character building is lost in macabre action. And while the violence of the first game served a compelling moral tale, the over-the-top bloodshed of Part 2 is all in service of a rather cliched and tiresome lesson about the endless cycle of revenge. The banter that elevated the first game above mere dystopian fantasy is gone too, as Ellie often navigates this ultra-violent world on her own. It makes for a lonely, depressing experience at a moment when many of us are already feeling lonely and depressed." Now, this is an interesting thing to keep note of when we are playing the game. I like violence in a game. It's alright, I enjoy it. But if it goes over the top and kind of overshadow the main story, it would be a bit disappointing. Alright, for number 4 we have Unlikable Characters. What made the first game that much special is the fact that they spent so much time committing to building the characters of Ellie and Joel to the point that it was so relatable. Joel was a struggling father mourning the loss of his daughter. Ellie shows up at a moment when Joel was feeling hopeless. The characters were so relatable, we laughed with them, cried with them, we were attached to these characters so much that we cared for them. A YouTube channel called Skill Up actually had a very negative review of The Last of Us Part 2. According to him, any main character could be swapped out and it wouldn't make a difference. He also complained that he found it so difficult to connect with any of the characters in the game, and he said the tone of the story is suffocatingly bleak. A review by Kotaku says, The Last of Us 2 didn't give me any moments like in the first game. Druckmann says the core of the game is about these really intimate, intense relationships. I bring this up not to quote the game's marketing, but to try to understand what the people who made it thought they were doing. The story I experienced was about relationships only insofar as characters did things to each other. I didn't learn anything about what it means to be human, or what we are capable of when we are hurt, or what can happen when we want to hurt others. Now, of course, Naughty Dog raised the bar high with The Last of Us Part 1, but I'm not expecting as good a story from The Last of Us Part 2. But I want to connect with the characters in a level that I care about them. So make this happen and give us a compelling story, and we will be happy customers. Alright guys, you might have read many excellent reviews for The Last of Us Part 2. Of course, it's gonna be a huge game, one of the most anticipated games of 2020, and as some people say, it might potentially be a masterpiece. But I wanted to show you both sides of the coin so you can get an overall idea. Alright guys, I will make a review video of The Last of Us Part 2 once I finish playing the game, so stay tuned for that. Until then, subscribe my channel, like my videos, I'll see you in the next one.